My name is Vreth-Olon, Senior Observer of the Galactic Consensus, 3rd tier, licensed to document the rise and fall of civilizations across 14 star systems. I have watched empires dissolve. I have recorded the last transmissions of species who believed, right up until the very end, that someone was coming to save them. I have filed 17,000 reports in my career, and not one of them, not a single one, prepared me for what I witnessed orbiting the 3rd planet of the Sol system. But let me start from the beginning, because truly the beginning is the only part of this story that made any sense at all. The first time the Consensus sent a probe to the Sol system, it was purely routine. A yellow dwarf, 4 rocky inner planets, a scattering of gas giants, and one moderately sized moon that appeared to have been struck sideways by something enormous billions of years ago. Standard notation. The 3rd planet registered life. Multicellular, ambulatory, carbon-based. The probe logged it as Category 7, meaning it would check back in roughly 400 standard cycles. 400 cycles later, the probe returned. The 3rd planet had developed tool use. Interesting. Another 300 cycles. Agriculture, settlement, early metallurgy. Mildly remarkable. 200 more. Iron weapons, written language, organized religion, and, fascinatingly, a seemingly unstoppable impulse to build walls and then immediately argue about who the walls were for. The Consensus filed it under developing, standard trajectory, low priority. Nobody gave them a second thought. I certainly did not. I was young, assigned to the Dravith cluster, watching a species of beautiful crystalline thinking organisms slowly negotiate the terms of their first interstellar treaty. The Sol system was a footnote, a curiosity at best. Then came the Vorrakh Dominion. Now, I want to be very careful here. I want to be precise, because what happened next is something the Consensus does not like to discuss openly, and they like it even less when observers document it with the kind of unflinching accuracy that my career has been built upon. The Vorrakh Dominion arrived at Sol approximately 90 standard cycles before my assignment there. They came with 12 warships, a standard extraction fleet, and the kind of confident industrial efficiency that had already stripped 6 planets bare across 2 star systems. They were not conquerors in the theatrical sense. They did not make speeches. They did not demand surrender. They simply arrived, assessed the resource value of the planet, and began the standard Dominion process. Systematic orbital bombardment of industrial centers, followed by resource extraction, followed by departure. They had done this 41 times before. The 3rd planet at this point called itself Earth. Its dominant species called themselves humans. And the humans, bless their absolutely baffling little hearts, decided to fight back. The Vorrakh, I am told, were briefly amused. Then they were confused. Then they were not amused at all. The first engagement lasted 11 planetary rotations. The humans lost 92% of their orbital infrastructure in the opening salvo. Their early space stations cracked and burned. Their communication satellites were swept aside like dust. Their surface-to-orbit defense networks, which were genuinely impressive for a species that had only reached orbit a handful of generations ago, were neutralized within the first 3 rotations. The Vorrakh commander, a decorated war mind named Threxdova, sent a standard Dominion cease notice to the surface. It read, essentially, "You have lost, your continued resistance is pointless, submit, and your population will be permitted to survive as a labor class." The humans did not respond. Well, they responded, just not in any way Threxdova had anticipated. What the humans did next is the part of the story that I had to listen to 3 separate times before my translator convinced me it had not made an error. The humans, with 92% of their orbital infrastructure destroyed and their primary defense networks offline, gathered every piece of salvage they could pull from the wreckage of their own stations. They dragged fragments of burned-out relay towers, cracked hull plating from their destroyed defense platforms, melted communication arrays, engine housing from the 3 ships they had lost in the opening engagement. They pulled all of it together in the messy, smoldering orbital ring that the Vorrakh had left behind. And then, working in damaged pressure suits on 6 hours of oxygen at a time, they started building. Threxdova watched this on his observation feeds and reportedly said to his second-in-command, "What are they building?" His second-in-command replied, "Unknown. It appears to be some form of..." "Assembly? Assembly of what?" We are not certain. Can you tell me what it is made of? Their own wreckage, Commander. Vreth-Olon found this more puzzling than threatening. He gave the order to proceed with secondary bombardment of the planet's northern industrial continent while the humans were busy in orbit, playing with their ruined toys. This, historians would later note, was Vreth-Olon's first mistake. The human who designed what happened next was a woman named Korra Vance. She was 38 years old. She had previously worked designing deep water pressure reactors for an ocean energy company, and by all accounts she slept approximately 4 hours in the 11 days it took to build what she had designed. She had a team of 912 engineers, all of them working on rotating shifts in the damaged orbital assembly platform that the Vorrakh had somehow neglected to finish destroying. Most of them were working in suits. Some sections had no atmosphere at all. They welded in vacuum. They calibrated in silence. They wired systems together using parts that had been designed for completely different purposes, combining them in configurations that no engineering manual in human history had ever described, because no engineering manual in human history had ever needed to. One of her engineers, a man named HFY, reportedly asked her at hour 72, "Korra, does this actually work?" She replied, "Probably." He asked, "Probably how much?" She thought about it for a moment, squinting at her calculations, and said, 60-40. He said, "Those are not great odds." She said, "No, but the Vorrakh have 100% chance of finishing what they started if we do nothing. So 60-40 is significantly better than our current position." HFY went back to work. At hour 103, Vreth-Olon received a transmission from the orbital assembly platform. It was a human voice, calm, professional, almost annoyingly pleasant given the circumstances. The voice said, "This is Commander Neva Rusk of the Earth Orbital Defense Authority. I am transmitting this message to inform you that we have completed construction of a directed fusion emitter using salvaged components from the engagement of the past 11 days. This device is capable of sustained beam output in excess of your hull tolerance ratings. We have targeted your lead warship. You have 45 minutes to withdraw your fleet from the Sol system. If you do not withdraw, we will fire." Vreth-Olon stared at his communications officer for a long moment. "A directed fusion emitter?" he said. "Yes, Commander. Built from their wreckage? That is what they claim. In 11 days? Yes, Commander." There was a pause. "Is it possible?" he asked his chief engineer. His chief engineer, who was one of the finest technical minds in the Vorrakh Dominion, reviewed the readings from the orbital platform, cross-referenced them with the materials the humans had been observed gathering, ran the calculations twice, and then said, with the expression of someone who very much did not want to say what they were about to say, "Theoretically? No. The power coupling requirements alone would take 3 times the time they had, with 3 times the crew, using materials twice as refined as what they were working with." Vreth-Olon nodded. "So it is a bluff. That would be the logical conclusion, Commander. And yet," his chief engineer looked at the readings again, "and yet the energy signature coming off that platform is unusual." "Unusual how?" "Unusual in that it should not exist, Commander." Vreth-Olon did not withdraw. "I want to be clear that by every rational calculation available to him, this was a defensible decision. The humans had built a device from wreckage that his own best engineer said was theoretically impossible. The Vorrakh had 41 successful planetary extractions behind them. They had never lost an engagement. They had never encountered a species that fought this way, with this particular brand of absolute refusal to accept the conclusions that physics and military strategy were clearly pointing toward. He gave the order to continue. Korra Vance's device fired. What followed is documented in Consensus archives under the file designation VO Sol Incident Primary, and it is marked with the red band that means classified, not for public distribution, which is Consensus language for. This made us very uncomfortable, and we would prefer not to think about it. The Vorrakh lead warship, which was 3 times the length of the human assembly platform and had survived 6 previous major engagements, lost 60% of its forward hull plating in 4.3 seconds. The beam held for 9 seconds. Then it burned out exactly as Vreth-Olon's chief engineer's calculations suggested it should, because you cannot build a stable directed fusion emitter from salvage in 11 days, and Korra Vance knew that. She had never claimed the device would fire twice. She had only claimed it would fire once. Once was enough. Dova withdrew. I want to tell you what I felt when I first read that report. I want to tell you that I, Vreth-Olon, third-tier observer, veteran of 40 years in the field, experienced a sensation that my species does not have a single precise word for, but which I can best describe as the uneasy suspicion that the universe had just changed without asking anyone's permission. The humans had not won. They had not even been close to winning, in any traditional sense of the word. Their planet was scarred. Their orbital infrastructure was largely destroyed. They had built a weapon that worked exactly once and then collapsed into useless metal. They had lost more than they had saved. But the Vorrakh had left. And in the 41 planets the Vorrakh had previously visited, no one had ever made them leave. The consensus convened an emergency review. Arguments were made. Reports were filed. A committee was formed, which is what the consensus does when it encounters something it does not understand and hopes that a committee might make it more manageable. The committee's final recommendation, delivered 17 cycles after the incident, was as follows. The humans of Sol 3 represent an anomalous but likely temporary deviation from standard developmental trajectories. We recommend continued observation with no direct intervention. Their industrial recovery will take between 40 and 60 standard cycles. By that point, they will either stabilize into predictable patterns or face secondary collapse. Either way, no action is required at this time. I was assigned to Sol 3 6 cycles later. I was told it would be routine. I would like to say, for the record, that nothing about this assignment was routine. Not from the first day. Not from the first hour. Not from the first moment I looked down at that scarred, burning, absolutely impossible planet, and watched the humans down there doing what apparently they had been doing for their entire history. Building something new from what the universe had broken. I arrived at Sol 3 during what the humans called winter in their northern hemisphere. From orbit, the planet looked like something that had survived a very bad argument with the universe and was quietly deciding what to do about it. The scars from the Vorrakh engagement were still visible from space. Long, dark streaks across 2 continents where the orbital bombardment had hit industrial zones. 3 cities had been reduced to structural frameworks. The northern continent's manufacturing belt, once the most productive stretch of land on the planet by human measurement, was a long corridor of ash and reconstruction. And yet, from orbit there were lights. Not the sad, scattered lights of a civilization pulling itself into a corner to grieve. Thousands of them. Clusters of activity that my instruments identified as construction sites, running through the night, because the humans apparently did not believe that darkness was a reason to stop working. Orbital insertion showed me 17 separate launch sites active simultaneously. 17. For a species that had just lost most of its orbital infrastructure in an 11-day engagement, launching 17 rockets at once is not recovery. That is something else entirely. I filed my first observation note and described it as, quote, accelerated reconstruction, pace inconsistent with projected timelines. My supervisor at the consensus responded, revise your projections. I revised them 4 more times in the first cycle alone. The human I was assigned to observe most closely during this period was a man named Bael Okoro. He was 51 years old, he had been a physicist before the Vorrakh came, and after the Vorrakh came, he became something the humans called the Director of Stellar Defense Research, which was a title that had not existed before the engagement because the humans had not previously believed they needed one. Bael Okoro was not a dramatic man. He did not give speeches. He did not stand on platforms and deliver the kind of passionate address that other species use to motivate their populations in times of crisis. What he did was work. 16 hours a day, sometimes more, in a converted underground facility in the eastern mountain range of the second largest continent, surrounded by a team of 300 scientists who were collectively attempting to do something the consensus had quietly agreed, in several private committee meetings, was not physically achievable. They were trying to build a contained stellar reaction core. Not a fusion reactor. Not a large one. Not a very large one. Stellar core. A miniature star. A sustained, controlled, harnessable point of stellar-level energy output, small enough to fit inside a structure the size of a city block, powerful enough to run a planetary defense grid that would make a second Vorrakh engagement a significantly less attractive proposition. The consensus, when this project came to our attention through standard surveillance, convened yet another committee. The committee concluded, theoretically impossible with current human technology. I filed a note suggesting we perhaps stop using the word theoretically in relation to humans. Nobody responded to that note. I need to tell you about the moment I stopped being a detached observer. Every observer is trained for detachment. We are taught very early in our careers that emotional investment in a subject species compromises the quality of documentation. We are supposed to watch. We are supposed to record. We are supposed to resist the pull of what our species calls HFY, which translates roughly as the feeling of being changed by what you are witnessing without having consented to the change. I felt HFY on the 240th day of my observation. That was the day Bael Okoro's team ran their first sustained ignition test. I want to describe what that looked like from orbit because from orbit is where I was, and because the view from orbit is the only view that captures the full impossible scale of what happened. At 0300 hours local time, a point of light appeared in the eastern mountain range. It was small at first, smaller than the lights of the construction sites, smaller than the launch pads, smaller than the cities. Just a point, pinprick in the dark. Then it held. 10 seconds, 20, 40, full minute. The light did not flicker. It did not pulse the way a reactor would pulse. It burned with the clean, even absolute certainty of something that was not supposed to exist on the surface of a planet, something that belonged 93 million miles away at the center of a solar system, not sitting in a mountain range on a world that, by the consensus's own projections, should still have been pulling itself out of rubble. My instruments went loud all at once. The energy readings coming off that point of light were not reactor readings. They were not even close to reactor readings. They were stellar readings. Reduced, miniaturized, contained by engineering that my own species had theorized about for 200 cycles without ever successfully implementing, but stellar readings. For 4 minutes and 17 seconds, Bael Okoro's team ran a star. Then they shut it down because they had designed it to run for 4 minutes and 17 seconds on the first test, and Bael Okoro was the kind of man who did not push past his own design parameters without first confirming the data. I sat in my observation pod for a long time after the light went out. Then I sent a transmission to the consensus that said, simply, revise everything. The Vorrakh came back 11 cycles later. This time they did not send 12 warships. They sent 40. Vreth-Olon was not among them. The Dominion had apparently decided that Vreth-Olon's failure at Sol required a more experienced hand, and they sent a war mind named Gravak Sol, who had personally overseen 19 successful extractions and who had, by all available intelligence, never once in his career considered the possibility that a planetary engagement could go wrong. Gravak Sol arrived at the edge of the Sol system and sent a standard Dominion notification to the planet below. The notification said, essentially, we are back, we are larger, and this time we expect you to behave sensibly. The planet did not respond for 6 minutes. Then a transmission came back. It was Neva Rusk again, which I found personally satisfying, because I had been observing Neva Rusk for 11 cycles and she was exactly the kind of human that the consensus's behavioral models consistently failed to account for. She was calm in a way that suggested she had been waiting for this, not hoping it would not happen, waiting for it to happen. There is a significant difference between those two things, and the Vorrakh, to their considerable misfortune, did not understand that difference. Neva Rusk said, Commander, welcome back to the Sol system. Please be advised that in the 11 cycles since your last visit, we have made some changes to our orbital defense infrastructure. We are transmitting the specifications of those changes now so that you can make an informed decision. We would genuinely prefer a peaceful resolution, but we are fully prepared for the alternative. Gravak Sol received the specifications. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at them again. Then he called his chief engineer, a decorated technical officer named Vormeth, who had a reputation across the Dominion for being unflappable, and he showed Vormeth the specifications. Vormeth was flapped. What the humans had built in 11 cycles was not what the consensus had projected. It was not what anyone had projected. They had taken Korra Vance's one-shot device, which had burned out after 9 seconds and collapsed into useless metal, and they had spent 11 cycles figuring out exactly why it had burned out, and then they had solved every single one of those problems, one at a time, with the methodical, infuriating patience of a species that treats failure not as a conclusion but as a set of instructions. They had built 12 sustained orbital emitters, each one capable of continuous fire. They had rebuilt their orbital infrastructure, larger than it had been before. They had placed 17 deep space detection arrays at the outer edge of the system, which was how they had known Vorrakh Sol was coming 40 hours before he arrived, which was how Neva Rusk had 6 minutes to compose herself and her response before he called. And in the eastern mountain range of the second continent, behind 3 layers of reinforced shielding, Bael Okoro's team had a device that had successfully run for 4 minutes and 17 seconds on its first test and had been running on increasingly longer tests for the past 9 cycles. On the day Vorrakh Sol arrived, the device had a projected operational window of 6 hours at full output. 6 hours of stellar-level energy output, aimed at whoever needed aiming at. The Vorrakh specifications had never, in their entire 41 extraction history, included anything remotely like that. Vorrakh Sol did not attack. He did not withdraw immediately either. He sat at the edge of the system for 19 hours, which I found fascinating, because the Vorrakh do not typically take 19 hours to make decisions. They are an efficient species. They calculate, they decide, they act. The fact that Vorrakh Sol spent 19 hours at the edge of the Sol system, sitting there with 40 warships and presumably a very uncomfortable feeling in whatever organ the Vorrakh use for intuition, told me something important. He was afraid. Not of the emitters. Not even of the stellar device. He was afraid of the thing those weapons represented, which was a species that had been hit as hard as the Vorrakh had ever hit anyone, and had responded not by surrendering or collapsing or retreating into survival mode, but by spending 11 cycles building something that should not exist, on a timeline that should not be possible, from an industrial base that had been partially destroyed. He was afraid because he understood, with the clarity that comes from staring at specifications that rewrite everything you thought you knew about what an enemy was capable of, that hitting these particular beings harder was not going to produce the result that hitting things harder usually produced. He sent a transmission to the Dominion leadership. The transmission said, in essence, we may need to reconsider our approach to this system. The consensus received a copy of that transmission, as we receive copies of most things that pass through monitored space. There was another committee. There were more reports. There were debates that lasted 3 cycles about what exactly the humans represented and what, if anything, the Galactic Consensus should do about them. I submitted my final observation report on the 289th day of my assignment. It was 47 pages long. My supervisor said it was the most detailed report filed on a Category 7 species in the history of the Observer program. He also said it made him uncomfortable, which I took as a compliment. The report's conclusion read as follows, and I stand behind every word of it. The humans of Sol 3 do not conform to any developmental model currently in use by the consensus. They do not respond to force in predictable ways. They do not regard destruction as a reason to stop. They process catastrophe as information and use that information to build things that were not possible before the catastrophe occurred. The Vorrakh Dominion struck them with sufficient force to end 41 other civilizations. The humans used the wreckage to build a weapon. When that weapon burned out, they spent 11 cycles figuring out why it burned out, and then they built 12 weapons that do not burn out. They then built a star. I want to be very clear about that last sentence. They built a star. On a planet. They built a controlled stellar reaction core in a mountain range on a terrestrial planet, using technology they developed in approximately 11 standard cycles, starting from a scientific foundation that we had categorized as insufficient for this achievement by a margin of at least 200 cycles. They did this because they needed to. I have observed 42 species across my career. I have never filed a report like this one. My recommendation to the consensus is not one that falls within standard observer parameters, but I am filing it anyway. Stop underestimating them. Whatever projection model you are currently using for this species, revise it. Revise it significantly. And if any member of the consensus is currently entertaining the idea of an engagement with Sol 3 for any reason, I would strongly advise reviewing the Vorrakh's experience first. The humans are not a Category 7 species. I am not sure what category they are. I am not sure we have invented it yet. I left Sol orbit on the 301st day of my assignment. As my vessel cleared the outer system and prepared for full transit, I took one last look back at the yellow dwarf and its third planet. From this distance, the planet was just a blue-white point of light. Small. Unremarkable. The kind of thing you would fly past without a second thought. But I knew what was on that planet. I knew about the lights that ran through the night. I knew about the 17 launch pads and the 12 emitters and the mountain range with the star in it. I knew about Korra Vance, who had built a weapon from wreckage on 60-40 odds and gone to sleep for 16 hours when it worked. I knew about Bael Okoro, who did not push past his own design parameters without first confirming the data. I knew about Neva Rusk, who had been waiting, not hoping, for the Vorrakh to come back. I thought about all of it for a long time, watching that small blue-white point shrink in my aft sensors. Then I thought about the 41 planets the Vorrakh had visited before Sol 3. The ones that had not had a Korra Vance, or a Bael Okoro, or a Neva Rusk. The ones that had not, in their darkest moment, looked at the wreckage of everything they had built and thought, well, let us see what we can make from this. I thought about what the difference was between those planets and this one. I am still thinking about it. I expect I will be thinking about it for the rest of my career.